I do have a few concerns and questions with some of the assumptions of the study. First, most of my wheelhouse is going to be in financial, but educationally speaking, I have a couple of small things. And the first is dealing with, it's good that there would be a unified curriculum, right? However, I think we do need to take a look at other studies as well. And one thing I saw starting in 2017 and 2018, around that time frame, when the legislators put out the original legislation that started this whole process, right, with a pilot county school and things like that, it brought my attention to do a little bit of research just to see what has been done in the past, because this is not a new concept, right? And some states have gone to countywide schools. Some states have done some regionalization to positive effects and to negative effects. And what I saw in the analysis of the educational is when you increase the district size or the school size, for the more affluent communities, you don't necessarily see a huge educational impact. And this is from the 2017 Arkansas study. But what they said is when you have a higher level of poverty, there's more damage to larger school sizes and larger districts to that higher level of poverty students, where you see their test scores go down and graduation rates go down. And I didn't see that addressed or even mentioned in the study. And similar studies have been done in Alaska, California, Georgia, Montana, Ohio, Texas, and West Virginia that show similar things. When you don't see as much of a difference in a higher demographic, but when you have high poverty schools, the higher the school, it seems like the lower the attainment and education rate, and graduation rate, with the B. So that was my main concern with educational. But most of my concerns obviously come with the financial aspect of it. A couple things. There's certainly benefits. It's easy to see the benefits, right? There are absolutely redundancies in the central office functions and general administrative functions. If you look at, and a good exercise would be to take Vineland, for instance. Vineland has about just over 10,000 students, right? And about 30-some square miles. The entire county of Salem has, 10,700, something like that, students, so not too far off. And if you take a look at all the counties, all the general administration and all the financial administration, and compare it to Vineland, it is more by several $1 million, right? But it's not $6.8 million. So I was wondering if there's a way to get the calculation of exactly where that $6.85 million came from. I'd just be curious to see that. I looked at the analysis. It mentioned 5% savings in transportation and some generalizations, as we mentioned before. I was just curious to see where that came from, because I couldn't get the 6.85 when I tried to back into it. But what I did do is do some other research. And my concerns with some of the assumptions, and the number one concern I have is the assumption of the staffing and bringing all the guides together. Was there anything done with leveling up? And for instance, when I say leveling up is, for instance, we have Quinton, who has a step one salary of, I think, or maybe it's Oldsman's maybe, a step one salary of $58,000 and Elsinboro step one salary of $48,000. So you bring them together. The only way to make it equitable is to level up, meaning the highest step one would be everyone's starting salary, and the highest salary everyone's starting, so everyone would kind of see the increase. Was that analysis done, or are we just kind of saying it was 0% across the board there?
I could comment on that. So the salary guide is this fixed guide where a lot of people consider a step being a year of service. And I worked in Paramus, and Paramus didn't have a salary guide for many years. And when they decided to go to a salary guide, they had a job of putting each person on the guide. And we've talked earlier that you can't reduce a tenured staff member's salary. So what that meant is sometimes putting someone on a guide that was above their salary but below their years of service. And we saw this also in the South Huntington and the way they did their salary guide. And it's commented on in the study, but they sat down with the NJEA and worked cooperatively to place people on the guide, not necessarily where their years of experience was, but where their salary was in line with the education that they have. So there are mechanisms to do that, right, that spend whatever the agreed upon salary increase is in that pool of money without necessarily ramping up each guide level as you had indicated.
So if I understand correctly, is it theoretically possible for someone with, let's say, 10 years experience at Elsinboro to be at a lower step in this consolidated unit of someone, let's say, at step 1 in the higher district or burning of Oldsman's?
Yes.
Okay. Then my other concern with that is every district's different. We have a lot of the smaller districts that hire all their paraprofessionals part-time at a cost of $18,000. We have some larger districts that offer full family benefits, and the cost is closer to $70,000. Was that analysis done, or are we just saying we're going to continue that status quo across the board?
Yeah, the general assumption there is that those costs are going to be maintained. Same with the teacher salaries.
So in the consolidated district, we'll have some working part-time or contracted, and others still getting the full family benefits.
Or some middle ground, depending
Okay.
on how the board decides to handle that. So there may be a give and take. The net result would be the same. There was no
No
savings
net
generated
change,
from that.
sure. Same with custodians, drivers, all the support staff. Got it.
Correct. Again, in terms of doing a very conservative look at this, we tried not to, because it would just be a guess, right? What is the school board that doesn't exist yet going to decide to do? So we simply carried those costs forward, because obviously a district that uses part-time aides could decide to hire full-time aides if it wanted to, with or without consolidation. So
Sure.
your points are valid if you're actually running the district, but since we're not running it and we don't know who's going to be running it, we just left that alone.
Makes sense, makes sense. So the second thing is with the state funding, obviously choice was mentioned, that would be concerned because it's several $1 million. But the other is preschool. We have different communities here that do have tuition-free preschool within the last few years, and other districts do not. So the concern is, if we were to become a consolidated district, would that still be the case where, well, how would the state do that? Because it's basically a state grant for a lot of our districts. It was a competitive grant, they applied for it, they received it. Some districts have it, some do not. Would they give it to everybody at that point? Would they say, okay, we're going to look at the population of Salem County, everyone gets 3- and 4-year-old preschool, or would that hasn't been determined, I'm assuming, right?
Well, I don't think they would give it to everybody, right? The way the law is written, and obviously, as you know, state funding changes every year, the goal was to hold you harmless with existing aid, and then to enhance the availability of the adjustment aid for 8 years instead of 4. So the assumption made is that if you combine the districts, some are getting a certain amount of aid, that amount of aid would continue, because you're not going to get more, you're not going to get less, based upon the way they wanted to enhance the likelihood that districts would find this attractive.
The preschool issue actually is a fascinating one. You're right, it is a grant-based. This actually came up in another study we did, and ultimately our solution was that we would request within the confines of the study the commissioner to allow those grant programs to continue, because there are targeted to certain communities based on a whole bunch of different criteria, but that would be the best way to handle that targeted grant preschool program, the preschool expansion program.
So the communities inside that consolidated district would still have that grant-funded preschool program, and those out would have to apply like any other.
Yeah, that's the fairest
Okay.
way to do that. And by the way, I totally support business administrators doing educational research, so I love that.
I'm a learner at heart. That's for
No,
sure.
it's
I'm a
great
learner at heart.
stuff. But one of the things you'll find with some of those studies, the big differentiator is what was the motivation for the consolidation, and how did that carry itself forward? For example, Steve just mentioned that part of his budgetary assumptions was to make certain that the staff, to achieve the educational opportunity expansion that Henry and I indicated would be a benefit, were actually there. And then it comes down to, are those positions and offices carried forward into implementation? The word here is with fidelity. Are your plans going to be carried forward, or are you just using the consolidated district to cut funding and to save dollars? And that often
Absolutely.
becomes the issue with fidelity. But thanks for that. Matter of fact, if you want to shoot some of the ones that you found onto me, I'd love to see them. As always, a little wonk in me always loves that stuff. But thanks for raising. I
got
totally encourage you.
one more thing, if you don't mind, or a couple more things, actually. The new legislation, I think it's a great idea with a 10-year phase-in for the tax levy, but I don't think it can be overlooked what will happen in year 11 to 15, right? I mean, it's sure everyone's going to save money the first 10 years, but starting in year 11 to 15, you're going to see some substantial changes in tax levies, some saving a lot of money in some communities, having to pay much more in taxes. And I don't think that can be overlooked. I think it's a great way to start it because no one sees an immediate change, but you can't ignore what's going to happen in year 11 to year 15. And then the last thing I'll say is, there's
Just hang on one second, I'm just
Okay.
want to give Steve a chance to respond to that.
So a couple of things. When we finalized the study, the legislation hadn't passed yet. But the proposal that we had was the 10-year transition where everyone saved, and then phasing in the 100% equalized valuation. But we found, over a 5-year period, we found that the actual legislation calls for a 10-year phase-in. So, and in some of the charts, you could see that 100% equalized valuation provided the lowest increase. And so,
I agree.
And over that 20-year time horizon, those numbers could change also.
Drastically, sure.
So, yeah, so it's hard to really project or speculate as to what that impact's going to be 20 years down the road.
Sure, a lot can happen just in 10 years, let alone 20. So I guess the last thing I'll mention is, obviously this isn't the first study done for consolidation. There's been large studies. One of my favorites of 2017, Joint State Commissioner of Pennsylvania looking for ways the school districts say, and they have a lot to say about consolidation. And essentially what they're saying a lot of times is after 3,000 students, you don't really see the economies of scale or savings per student. And if you even look at New Jersey has a great tool called the New Jersey Taxpayer's Guide to Education, and they break out K-12s between 0 and 1,800 students, 1,800 and 3,500 students, and 3,500 plus students. And if you look at the budgetary cost per pupil, guess where the most financially economical districts run? Between that 1,800 and 3,500. It's actually more expensive on a budgetary cost per pupil if you look at the average at 3,500 and more versus 1,800 to 3,500. So I think and they've showed a lot of savings specifically with smaller districts, 300 and under, 200 and under, but you don't see that same savings once you get to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. And an example would be Vineland, for instance. If we look at the fiscal year 19, which is what we looked at here, it's a good year to look at because it's the last year before the pandemic, right? So if you look at that, 8 out of 13 districts had a lower budgetary cost per pupil than neighboring Vineland did. And 3 of those are K-12s, including Pittsgrove, and Woodstown / Pilesgrove. And matter of fact, Woodstown Pilesgrove spent almost $3,000 less per pupil than Vineland in the budgetary cost per pupil. So I think just saying that increasing the size of the school district, yes, it will absolutely save in central services. I do believe that there's assumptions that haven't been looked at for fair reasons because it's hard to look at them, that I think would also diminish potentially that $6.8 million. Thank you.